three questions are raised throughout most of the Gospels. They are three related questions, and they are three questions that ultimately only Jesus himself is able to answer. They are part of the message of the angel to Mary before Jesus' birth, a part of the nativity story, part of Jesus' visit to the temple at age 13, part of the reason why he goes to be baptized by his cousin, to be tempted in the wilderness and then become one of his cousin's disciples, why he returns to Nazareth and then eventually settles in Capernaum and begins this itinerant rabbi ministry that carries him through at least the next year. Three questions that are ultimately and only partially answered in the Transfiguration story. Is Jesus the Messiah? Is Jesus the Anointed One, the chosen one of God? And if Jesus is the Messiah, what is he supposed to do? What is to be his goal and purpose as the Messiah? And how is he to achieve that goal? They're not questions that are clearly raised in a very visible way, but they're there in all of those events leading up to the Transfiguration. But only at the Transfiguration do they kind of emerge and become part of the agenda of Jesus and his disciples. As Jesus normally does with his disciples, he's wandering around the countryside, speaking to people, healing people, teaching people, interacting with people wherever he finds them, often out of doors. They're in the area of Caesarea Philippi, going from village to village, and on their way, Jesus seems to ask what is a casual question. Who do people say that I am? It's not really that casual. Jesus is trying to find out whether others have come to the same conclusion about him as he has. Who do people say that I am? And the disciples respond, well, some think you're John the Baptist alive again. Some think you're Elijah come back. Some think you're one of the prophets. Okay. But who do you say that I am? He says to his disciples. And Peter, with boldness, as Peter will tend to do, he says, you are the Christ. You are the Messiah. You are the chosen one. Now, Jesus has not done this really in order to be able to be sure that he is. He knows already that he is the Messiah, but he wants to know whether his disciples know that he is the Messiah because of what he's about to say to them. For what he says to them next is, because I am the Messiah, because I am the Christ, I must go to Jerusalem, and I must suffer there, and I must die there. Nobody knew that that's what the Messiah was supposed to be about. There was a lot of theories at that time as to the purpose of the Messiah. To drive out the Romans, to reestablish the kingdom of David, to rebuild the temple in all its magnificent glory. But nobody except Jesus understood that the purpose of the Messiah was to die. And so he's testing the waters. Do these people who are surrounding me, these disciples who perhaps have come to an understanding that I am the Messiah, do they also understand the implication of that, what I must do? And clearly, based on Peter's response, they don't. Peter basically says, Jesus, you're crazy. This is not what you're supposed to be doing. And, you know, it's easy to pick. I love to pick on Peter. I often did. I was at St. Peter's Episcopal Church before I retired finally, and boy, I had a great deal of fun with Peter. But we got to cut Peter a little bit of slack. But first off, the sheer shock of hearing this master that he serves tell him that he's going to go and die, because that's what he's supposed to do, was bad enough. But remember, Peter had been a follower of John first. And Peter had experienced the loss of John to death. He didn't want to do that again. And so he calls Jesus to task. He says, "You're wrong. That's not what you're supposed to do as the Messiah. No, no." And Jesus, perhaps a little unsympathetically, rebukes him. He doesn't explain to Peter why, in fact, he believes he is the Messiah. He doesn't explain to Peter why, in fact, he thinks he has to go to die because he is Messiah. He rebukes Peter, perhaps a bit unfairly. And then he says, "Look, don't tell anybody about this. Because frankly, if you guys are having this much trouble with what I just told you, think of what they are going to have." Now we jump a week ahead. Now, I found myself asking, how come this next part takes place a week later? I mean, if Jesus has had this encounter with his disciple, there's a whole lot of tension in the air. That week is going to be very hard. He's going to come up again and again if they're still together. But what if they're not? We make some assumptions, don't we? We assume that Jesus went involved in his ministry for 3 years. No proof. We assume that Jesus was doing it 24/7. Impossible. He didn't have the resources to be able to feed and house 13 men day in and day out. These were men who had families. They had businesses to tend to. They had other things going on in their life. They couldn't spend all of their time wandering around the countryside with Jesus. So my suspicion is they only did it on the weekend. It's a funny concept, but think about it. That's when they had time to do it, was on the weekend. And that's why the next part of this story takes place sometime between 6 and 8 days later. Because they're back together again, wandering around the countryside of Galilee, teaching and healing and preaching. Only this time it's different. Jesus tells most of his disciples to stay over there with the choir and be quiet. And he takes Peter, James, and John with him, and he says, "Sit over here and be quiet." And he goes up on the top of a mountain, and he has a conversation with 2 men who are identified, interestingly, as Moses and Elijah, representing the law and the prophets. But of course, there's a problem. How the heck did anybody know that that was Moses and Elijah? Nobody had a picture of them. I don't think they had a name tag on that said, "Hey, I'm Moses. Hi, I'm Elijah." Somehow, I'm assuming that maybe Jesus eventually said, "Hey, Peter, would you like to meet Moses and Elijah before they leave?" He has this conversation, and his appearance is transformed. He's aglow while he has this conversation, about which we know absolutely nothing. Oh, I would love to have had CNN present to have recorded that conversation. But it isn't recorded. We don't know if Elijah and Moses were saying, "Yes, Jesus, you're right, you're the Messiah, you need to go to Jerusalem and die," or they were saying, "Jesus, you're crazy." We don't know what they talked about. But we do know what happened after the conversation, which is very enlightening. Peter, this time, is ready for Jesus. He says, "Jesus, I've got this marvelous idea. let's create a theme park. And we'll set up 3 tents, and you can be in one, and Moses can be in another, and Elijah can be in another. We'll have a little concession over here. We'll charge admission. We can stop all this tomfoolery of walking all around the countryside, meeting with people, and we can simply relax. We'll come together on the weekend. We'll open the gates. People will come to see you. It's all going to be wonderful. It makes sense from Peter's point of view. A, it still doesn't involve Jesus dying. B, it means that they're going to have some money to work with. And C, they don't have to do any of this trapping around the countryside anymore. Only I'm sure he doesn't bargain on what the response he gets. Not from Jesus, but from a voice from heaven. And I would suggest you make sure you understand that voice is ticked off. It's not saying, this is my son, I really think he's kind of nice and neat, you really pay attention to him. He's saying, Peter, shut up. This is Jesus, my Messiah. Listen to him. At which point, the story ends. But it doesn't. Because from that point on, in his ministry, Jesus' sole focus is to go to Jerusalem and die. He's not going to go around healing people anymore. He's not going to go around teaching people anymore. He's not going to wander around the Galilean countryside anymore. He's going to go to Jerusalem and die. That was not his purpose before the Transfiguration. That is clearly his purpose after the Transfiguration. And I think that happens rather quickly. I said before that Jesus is not a 24/7 person running a 24/7 ministry. It's limited not only by the disciples' other lives, but also by the weather. There are parts of that, times of that year in that area where the weather is pretty, almost as, well, actually it's better than ours. They actually have snow. We don't. And one of the results of that is that actually Jesus' ministry only takes up maybe perhaps 5 or 6 months of the year. The rest of the year, it's too cold and too wet for people to be in touch with him. So we're talking about a shorter period of time. I think it's quite possible that Jesus has this encounter in late March, and that the following Passover in April is when he fulfills his destiny, which makes an interesting redefinition of the 40 days of Lent. As I was putting this sermon together, I didn't know how to end it. And I realized I can't, because the story doesn't end here. After Jesus has this transfiguration experience, he enters into that journey to Jerusalem, that journey to Holy Week, that journey to the cross. And he will not stop until he gets there. Everything he does from that point on is solely intended to accomplish that goal. What's happened, I found, and why perhaps it was difficult to end the sermon, is that is what has happened to Lent. More and more, Lent is less a time of remembering the temptation for 40 days in the wilderness, and more a time of journeying to Jerusalem. Going with Jesus to Jerusalem, entering the city with him, visiting the temple with him, sharing the meal with him, praying in the garden with him, standing at the foot of the cross and dying with him. Lent is being redefined in light of the Transfiguration. I can't end the sermon because that journey for us hasn't yet begun. It begins on Wednesday. Now, I know there's going to be a whole lot of other stuff going on over the next few weeks here. Somebody else is going to be in this pulpit next week. Somebody else is going to be in the pulpit the week after that. And you're probably going to forget anything I said today. But I still invite you to keep a Holy Lent. And part of keeping a Holy Lent is to go on that journey with Jesus. The journey that began at the Transfiguration and ends at the cross. Because one thing I have learned and noticed in recent years is that many people believe you can go to Easter services without ever having attended any Holy Week services. Easter means nothing unless you have first walked the way of the cross. That's the invitation of a Holy Lent. To walk with Jesus in a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, to stand with Jesus at the foot of his cross, and then to understand what it meant that he was raised from the dead. Amen.